Hey everyone, welcome back to YouTube. We are jamming out today on the things that are in our control and outside of our control. Now, we all as men know that control is something that we really inherently have. I will tell you this, majority of men have that desire to control their environment. And especially the men out there that lean towards a little stronger personality. Now, I don't want to just classify every man as like an alpha, but even a little stronger of a personality, dudes tend to want to have control. Inherently, it's kind of been something I would probably say that's evolved with us as human beings, because when we control as much as we can of our environment, we have that ability to make adjustments quicker and to foresee issues that may come up, problems that may come up, or even just inherent threats, right? So I think that this is something we've carried a long time with us, and I don't see it as a problem, but I do see it as understanding it and also understanding how to leverage it, right? Now, this is what's important, because inherently when we have something that could essentially be a positive and a negative at the same time, you know that the saying of the double-edged sword, when we have and carry something like that with us, we have to be very mindful of how it can affect our lives in both capacities. And so when we look at control and we look at that desire for it, right, and that inherent desire to say, I control every situation, so I have to do X, Y, and Z, well, we look at how that can lead to poor relationships. We also look at how that can lead to a lot of failure. It also can lead to a lot of sadness, stress, anxiety. And then on the flip side, if we learn to release control of some of the things in life, right? Like then we allow ourselves a little more freedom, a little more fluidity, creativity. We allow ourselves adaptability. There's a lot of good things that come with it. Now, on the same side, control does end up giving us predictability, right? So when we do have it, we're able to say, yeah, I can somewhat predict how this is going to turn out, which is great, because then you have a known value for it, right? Which can actually allow you to soften and create better connection with people, and also create a more receiving environment of what is to happen and what is to transpire. So there is that level of comfort that comes with certain levels of control. And on the flip side of lack of control, there is the unexpected, right? So things that are outside of everything that you are able to manage and react to, the unexpected, the catching you off guard, right? That's why we say that, because off guard means that we hadn't controlled the environment and therefore we weren't ready for whatever took place. Inherently, we don't want that. It's bad. It's a bad survival instinct, right? So this is why I believe we've evolved with this as human beings, because at one point, this control served us so much that it allowed us to survive and thrive and become where we are now. Well, maybe not thrive, but survive to become the human beings, the multi-celled organisms that we are today, and with the societies that we have. On the same side, it ended up being incredibly bad in some ways because of the fact that we ended up struggling with it now. We haven't figured out how to understand that control to give ourselves a little bit more freedom in a world that isn't so inherently dangerous, and give ourselves the ability to embrace different ways to live life in this new environment for ourselves. So that's where we struggle with it. And so when it comes to this level of control, we got to figure out what is in our control and what is outside of our control. Now, a lot of this has to do also with how we see the world and the perspective that we have as men with the world, and how we judge and assume and place anger towards different directions, or we place threats in different directions, and we don't understand why we're doing that, but we want to, right? Like when we have all of that shit going on, we end up giving ourselves a really myopic view of the world, and we can only enjoy so much, right? So now we have this conversation of, when we're talking about control, how much of it do we necessarily need, and how much of it is actually within really our control? When we try to create control in our environment of other people, well, is that really controllable? Now, it is if you're a complete dick, or you're fucking actually, taking somebody and holding them against their will. Of course, there's levels of that, but those are obviously very bad versions of control in general. And I would say that there's a lot of bad versions of control too when we emotionally try to control people, because then we're creating a trauma aspect with them, and then for them, they don't see you as somebody that is safe at all, even though you feel safe because you have complete control as much as possible, right? Because you've learned how to manipulate. That's also a negative version of control. But when we're looking at this, we want to say, okay, if we cannot control other people in our lives, like they all have their own brains, their independence, their sovereignty, their autonomy, they're going to do what they want, right? Can't control people. What can we control in our environment at all times? Well, we control our internal nature, right? Which is our emotions. We can control the way that we see things and hear things. We can question before we speak. We can question before we act. We can control our entire internal environment. Now, responses, especially emotional responses, don't happen unless we perceive a scenario some way to create a certain emotion. Emotions aren't things that inherently come up. They take a conscious process for us to associate with that environment or with that action or those words for us to have a sense of emotion. Now, majority of this happens subconsciously, which is why the fact that you feel like an emotion comes out of nowhere when somebody says something or when somebody does something to you, right? You all of a sudden create a scenario and a perception around it within milliseconds, and within that time frame, your body has created an emotional response and a chemical release to reflect that emotion. What we can control is that. As much as it sounds like we can't, by my definition here, we can control that. We can't control other people, and we can control the things that we touch around us, right? Like we can control the manipulation somewhat to the material world in front of us. Like that's what we can do. And when we acknowledge the fact that those are our levels of control within society or within our lives, it allows us to say, okay, now everything that is within me that happens, and everything that I do with, these things and, this immediate material world around me is responsible to me. Well, now I can start to make assessments of, okay, if something happens outside of that, it was outside of my control. So why should I classify it as something that is going to have an emotional response that doesn't serve me or serve the relationship or serve the betterment of the environment, right? That is the biggest question that I think we need to start having is, if I cannot control it, why do I let it dictate, right? And so we have to assess what is that control that we have. So I told you what I believe that control to be. You're going to have potentially a different version of this, but you're going to say this is what you believe your control level is. And then you're going to have to understand what it is that is outside of that purview. And then we have to come to a point of releasing that. Now, why? Because the fact when we figure out how to release it, we can fully start to create autonomy within our own lives and create that sovereignty, that such desired sovereignty that everybody wants, right? That freedom, because the fact that we control the emotions that come out of us. We control what is reacting, what is being said, and how we show up in every environment. This is where authenticity comes into play. This is where we can really harness ourselves and say, what is the power within us to really change the aspect of our lives, or the trajectory of our lives, the trajectory of our relationships? That is incredibly important. If we can move in this manner and figure out what that control level is, how we can manipulate it to be consistent with truly what we are able to control, then we can really have that governance that we're really looking for individually within our lives. And as we do that individually, we end up creating a lot more happiness because we release what is not controllable to us, and we allow ourselves to just really absorb what is controllable to us. And the byproduct of that is ownership. And the byproduct of that is a lack of excuses. When we release the excuses, and we're going to talk about this on another episode, but when we release those excuses, we allow ourselves the freedom to say, hey, I'm responsible. And if I'm responsible, then I actually have the ability to change things. Instead of deferring and becoming the victim, right, which we've talked about before, but instead of deferring and becoming the victim to life or the victim to circumstance, we say, hey, there's a level of control within me that could have taken place before this circumstance happened, and I get to take ownership of that, and then I get to erase the excuses I was going to employ and put forward my own attempt to say, hey, this isn't going to happen again. How do I bypass that, or how do I become consistent with a mindset that allows me to maneuver around it so that I don't approach that situation or that encounter or that conversation in a way that isn't going to serve me? Because it doesn't mean you're avoiding things in life. You're really just cutting out the things that don't serve you in life. And that's what's important. When we can focus on what serves us, then we can stay away from the things that are energy vampires, right? And that's what we want to do. We want to release ourselves from the energy vampires in the world, so that way we can gain more pleasure out of our own lives. No one ever said life had to inherently be incredibly difficult, and nobody ever said you can't have happiness in life. So if we take those two opposites there of inherently difficult and happiness, and we try to bridge the gap between that, then saying that we have the ability to be happy and giving ourselves to inherently maneuver around and adjust to the things that inherently will take us to unhappiness, we can gain that sovereignty over our world. So just a tip for guys, guys and gals, but for all you guys out there that are really struggling with control, I know this is an inherent thing within us. So if you can break this down within your own life and what you do as a pattern of control, and then you can start to become aware of what you engage in as a controlling behavior and remove that, especially when you're trying to control things out of your control. We tend to exacerbate those traits and really overshadow the people around us when we are trying to control what we're not able to control. That's when we get more aggressive in our ways of trying to control. This is where, just there's a lot of different versions of this. And it's one of the tools of narcissists is to have a level of control like this, to constantly have a level of control like that. And there's different modalities in which they do it. But when we do that, we're not giving the people in our lives the ability to truly relate with us. And we're also not giving ourselves that happiness that we really can find, because we're always trying to control things that we are going to get, we're going to fail at controlling at the end of the day. So just remember that, implement this in your life. Take a look at what those byproducts are that you do, see what it is, how you apply that in your life, and then try to remove that or be aware of it and at least catch it, right? So, all right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed this episode on YouTube. I'll see y'all next week.